On April 21, 2015, the Canadian federal government announced funding in the budget for expansion of the First Nation Land Management Act regime. Quote, the budget invests $30.3 million over 5 years, roughly $6 million a year for bands admitted under the First Nations Land Management Act. The 2013 budget put $9 million over 2 years towards the land regime. The continuation of funding is expected to accommodate about 25 First Nations, which are expected to come under the regime. There are currently 94 First Nations which have been accepted under the Act. This is a pre-election federal budget, contains no big-ticket items for First Nations APTN. This despite there being no evidence of economic investment directly attributable to the FNLMA regime. Only surveys filled in by the First Nation councils, those in it and having no way out of it. Quote, none of the First Nations surveyed in 2009 or 2013 reported a desire to revert back to the Indian Act, even if this were a possibility under the framework agreement, which it is not. It is trite to point out that this effort was not an independent assessment, but rather a mere compilation of survey results, filled in by the FNLMA First Nations having an incentive to say things are going great, especially since they struggle with budget negotiations with the federal government. There are no photographs and no indication that anyone from KPMG, the accountants, even stepped outside of their offices to compile this report. I have done this sort of work before for a marketing class in university. It is simply a matter of tallying up and summarizing what is filled out on the surveys. The LAB has to justify its existence. The LAB is the Lands Advisory Board, since it was originally only set up for 5 years under the framework agreement. Section 31.1, Canada will enter into a funding arrangement with the Lands Advisory Board for the 5-year period following the coming into force of this agreement. But most important are the qualifiers KPMG provides to the FNLMA survey. Quote, limitations. 1. In a number of survey questions, First Nations were asked to elaborate on results across different types of investment arrangements, such as whether a particular investment was made by the band only, the band plus a third party, a First Nations member plus a third party, etc. Questions 18, 20, 24, 26, and 29. There were very few First Nations who were able to provide this level of detail, and therefore the responses did not produce a reliable result. Therefore, these questions were not included in the analysis of data nor referenced in this report. 2. The quantitative information provided for internal, external investment and jobs created are considered estimates. They were derived by taking the midpoint of a set of ranges and multiplying by the number of respondents that chose each given range. These estimates are not considered scientific, and these figures are intended strictly to provide an order of magnitude of total investment and total jobs created. Further quantitative data in Phase 3 is expected to confirm these estimates. End of quote. It is disturbing that the FNLMA operational First Nations do not know the investment arrangements. As for investment and jobs information, it is not surprising that these are merely estimates extrapolated from survey results. If there were actually great investment news attributed to the FNLMA, it would have been all over the media. Instead, the FNLMA survey notes, quote, a general important finding identified through the data collection was that for many aspects of economic development advancement, Group A in 2013 are starting to experience a plateau effect. That is, where we saw rapid progress in 2009 compared to their pre-land code situation, by 2013, when surveyed again, progress continued but at a much more gradual pace. This would suggest that over time, changes continue, but year over year, it can be expected that the incremental change may be less. lending me to ask the most obvious question. Would it not have been possible to get those leases in place under the Indian Act process? The price paid is steep if there is a short-lived burst of economic development that may well have been possible to achieve without the FNLMA. There is limited liability for those helping to get the FNLMA in place. No one can be sued personally for their role in providing advice. Here is how the Resource Council describes themselves. The Resource Council is the technical body intended to support First Nations in the developmental and operational phases implementing the Framework Agreement. The Resource Centre's functions are developing model land codes, laws, and land management systems, developing model agreements for use between First Nations and other authorities and institutions, including public utilities and private organizations. On request of a First Nation, assisting the First Nation in developing and implementing its land code, laws, land management systems, and environmental assessment and protection regimes. Assisting a verifier when requested by the verifier. Establishing a resource center, curricula, and training programs for managers and others who perform functions pursuant to a land code. On request of a First Nation encountering difficulties relating to the management of its First Nation lands, helping the First Nation in obtaining the expertise necessary to resolve the difficulty, proposing regulations for First Nation land registration. What is important to note is that KPMG does not sign off on the forward to the FNLMA survey. Instead, the forward is signed by Chief Robert Louis, Chair, LAB, and by Chief Austin Bear, Chair, FNLMRC. Here it is in full. Quote, "The Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management is historic. As First Nations, we governed our lands since time immemorial, long before the Indian Act was imposed on us. The completion of the Framework Agreement in 1996 represents the only time in Canada's history that a group of First Nations have joined together to design, negotiate, and sign a government-to-government arrangement with the federal government to resume this governance. The Framework Agreement is the first real recognition of our inherent right to be self-governing. The Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs confirmed this in his 1999 address to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and Northern Development. The Framework Agreement and this legislation provide signatory First Nations a legitimate, organized, and controlled means of taking back the authority to manage their lands and resources at the community level and pass laws regarding how their land is developed, conserved, protected, used, and administered. The Framework Agreement is led by First Nations. The goal was to leave behind the paternalistic constraints of the Indian Act and resume our rightful governing authority over our reserve lands and resources under a land code designed and ratified by our members. We consider land governance to be the cornerstone of Indigenous self-government and self-efficiency. Framework Agreement First Nations are able to work efficiently with business investments that bring productive economic development opportunities to our communities. We function at the speed of business as a result of our direct authority over reserve lands and natural resources. Financial institutions want to partner with Framework Agreement First Nations because we have clear, transparent, and accountable governance structures in place, including rules and regulations that provide security and comfort to investors. We were able to provide certainty in land interests, low land transaction costs, and land laws that are recognized by courts and enforceable. The Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada stated, "This framework agreement means that First Nations can undertake projects without having to turn to me for their approval. They have the flexibility to move quickly when economic opportunities arrive or when partners approach them. In that way, they can get on with the task of creating jobs and encouraging economic growth in their communities." The First Nation Lands Advisory Board, which represents a Framework Agreement, First Nations, and the board's technical body, the First Nations Land Management Resource Centre, were pleased to collaborate with Canada in 2009 and have the international firm of KPMG LLP conduct a study on the Framework Agreement costs and benefits. Now, 4 years later, KPMG is updating the benefits as of 2013. The Lands Advisory Board is very pleased to accept Phases 1 and 2 of the 2013 report. Phase 3 in 2014 will provide further evidence in support of Canada's investment in the Framework Agreement. A case study approach will present in-depth examples of benefits in such areas as economic development and job creation, internal and external investments by the band, community members and third-party partners, and enhanced relations with industry, other jurisdictions, and financial institutions, end of quote. As said, KPMG did not sign off on that description. It was a survey. Before setting out what the FNLMA regime is, it is important to understand a little history of the FNLMA regime since Appleseed. The lab, set up in 1996 under the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management, Framework Agreement, is chaired by Chief Robert Louis, West Bank First Nation. When the LAB began, he was chief of the West Bank Indian Band. The West Bank First Nation came into existence in 2004. This is how Robert Louis sees why not everyone is getting on board the FNLMA regime. Quote, Senator Sibiston, I know from my own life and experience that there is a lot of fear. In the Northwest Territories, where we have come from the land and from a traditional life much more recently than other First Nations across the country, people are comfortable with the traditional life. It is almost like not wanting to become a white man, not wanting to become sophisticated. They would rather just be where they have been. To be rich or to be in business is not considered a good, positive thing. It is like being co-opted into the system. There is a mentality involved, an unwillingness to be bold and take a chance to get on with being part of Canadian society. There have been some groups in the north, like the Inuvialuit in the Delta area, that have been successful and have embarked upon and embraced economic development. They have done very well. On the other hand, there have been other groups that have hung back and have not been certain. They do not have the confidence and trust to make bold moves. I think it involves that mentality. Obviously, those that have been successful are those that are sophisticated and have had enough experience and confidence in themselves to forge forward and do all the things that other Canadians do to be successful in business, to be rich, to wear suits with ties and walk around proudly with briefcases, that whole different world. It is the business world that we are talking about and that Native people are getting into. Do you think I am right? Mr. Louis' response, yes, Senator, I believe you are. This was the evidence presented on November 16, 2011, proceedings of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. Senator Sibiston was no doubt a, quote, good Indian, end of quote, throughout his education. Nick Sibiston, born November 21, 1943, is a Canadian senator. He attended residential school in Fort Simpson, Providence, Inuvik, and Yellowknife, and the University of Alberta, where he graduated with Bachelor of Arts and Law degrees. But he ought to be reminded of a Creole proverb from Louisiana, and I'll say this only in English. Cutting off a mule's ears won't make him a horse. Indigenous people are fully human, with no need to be altered to become a white man in order to become human. And it is such an incredible testament to their strength that despite so many previous and ongoing efforts, so much disfiguration, that they still know who they are and still carry what they do. That is not the mark of fear. That is courage and bravery, respect for past and future generations.